Hey guys, my name's Avispira, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to shoot manual mode on just about any camera. We're not talking about these old ones behind me. We're going to be talking more about modern ones with a flip out screen like I'm using right now, the Panasonic G7. How to shoot manual is going to consist of basically learning three specific camera settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now you're going to hear those terms a lot when you're working in the camera space. And whenever you take a really cool image, someone might ask you what ISO you took that on, what aperture that lens that you were using was. And I'm going to be explaining all three settings, how to use them using the Panasonic G7. But once you know where they're located on just about any camera, as long as there's a manual mode, you can change them and you'll be able to use and shoot manual on just about any camera, giving you a lot more functionality and a lot better looking image. Alright guys, now it's time to explain what the three settings are: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and what they all do individually. Starting off with aperture. So, I'm going to switch my camera over to manual mode, and I have two dials on my camera to control shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed we'll be getting into in a bit. Let's start off. Alright, that's a pretty normal shutter speed. Again, don't worry about that. I'll explain it all soon. So aperture, starting off on this lens, yes, it depends on your lens, is 3.5. And when I zoom my lens in, you can see here it automatically goes to 5.6. I'm not touching the dials, it automatically changes. The way how aperture works is the lower the number is, the more light you're letting into your camera. So what's the trade-off here? Why wouldn't I just keep my aperture on the lowest possible and have as much light as possible for my image? Well, when you take an image at a low amount of aperture, you're getting something called a depth effect. And I'm going to go ahead and show images on screen so you get what I'm talking about. And you see that the image on the left has a lot more of the foreground and background than the image on the right. The image on the right is taken at a lower aperture, and it gets that nice separating the subject from the foreground and background. While the image on the left, if you take that aperture at a little bit too high, you're not going to be able to focus as much as what you want the person to focus on in your image, which is very important to photographers. When you take a landscape image, you're going to want the aperture to be at the highest possible, which is 22. Of course, this does depend a little bit on your camera. So when you're taking an image at f22, you're going to be losing a lot of light, which you're going to have to trade off from your shutter speed and ISO and other settings. That is the trade-off on what aperture does to your camera. And I mentioned earlier that on this lens, that's how it works. And when zooming in, you do let in less light. But I do want to say that if I were to switch lenses right now, I have on this camera right now, I have a 14mm to 42mm f3.5 to 5.6, while this lens right over here, I'm going to go ahead and take the lid off and show you guys, has a aperture of 1.7 and a fixed millimeter of 25. So while I can't move it, as a portrait lens it's great because it separates my subject from the foreground and background a lot more, and it lets in a lot more light if I'm taking images in a dark area. So that is aperture. Now to explain shutter speed and how that works along with the other two settings. So shutter speed changes how quickly you take the image. For example, if I go ahead and change the shutter speed right now to 1 second, which is the minimum on this camera, my camera will take an image and the sensor will remain open for an entire second, allowing more light to come in. While if I take the image at the fastest, which is 16,000 of a second, the image will come in completely dark. And that's because I'm not letting enough light into the sensor. So you're going to want to find that middle sweet ground. But as I said earlier, when you're taking landscapes, you're going to want your aperture to be a lot higher, which will mean that you're going to have to lower your shutter speed. So you're going to have to find that equal balance between these settings to get the perfect image. So shutter speed the way how you decide when to change it is depending on your subject matter, and I'm going to go ahead and show more examples on screen. If you're taking pictures at a party and there's some kind of dance or something going on, you're going to want a higher shutter speed so you can capture the people that are moving. While if you're doing landscape photography or you're doing subject photography and you don't need fast, you don't need the pictures to be taken quickly, you just need them to come out well, then you're going to lower your shutter speed, take the picture at a long sensor exposure, allowing more light to come in. Now, I do want to give a little tip here. While we're at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put my camera onto the timer setting. So when you're taking a picture that's at a very low shutter speed, let's go ahead and put it down to 1 second, what you should do, preferably, is change your camera to the self timer, go ahead, click it, and then back away, and let your camera take the picture at a long exposure, and that way you remove any handshake, you're able to put your camera down, there's not going to be any worry because you have those 2 seconds where your camera isn't being touched and it can take the picture, and you have nothing to worry about when it comes to jitter or movement, especially at such a low shutter speed. Finally, I'm going to explain to you guys ISO. So ISO is the setting that on my camera isn't even a dial, it's actually a button. And here it's located and I can change the number, and it looks pretty similar to shutter speed, but it does a completely different function. So what ISO does is change the way that your camera perceives light. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive your camera will be to light, which makes the image grainier, but at the same time gives you that artificial light. So that was way overexposed. While if I go to my lowest ISO, I have a much clearer, less grainy image, but I'm sacrificing artificial light, giving me a darker image. So this is, of the 3 settings, my least favorite to change, because I want the crystal clearest picture I can possibly get, unless I'm doing video. So when taking pictures, I'll leave it at 200, which is the minimum on my camera. Some cameras do have it even lower, and I will change my shutter speed if I have to, I'll change my aperture if I have to, and try to get the best image I can without sacrificing picture quality, which is basically what ISO sacrifices. You're getting a grainier image. While shutter speed, you're getting a jittier image, you're getting, weird movements, so you're going to want to keep that at an even level as well. And aperture, you're trading off, basically, subject focus. So that's what the 3 settings change, and you can change them, accordingly to depending on whatever the set is. You might leave your ISO on automatic and, only change your aperture. I have here on this camera, I have specific modes just to change the shutter speed and just to change the aperture. So if I'm taking portrait photography, then I really only want to change my aperture, make sure it's minimum, and let the camera decide the shutter speed and ISO. Of course, I like to keep my ISO at a minimum, so I'm going to most of the time be in manual mode. That should explain to you guys the 3 settings, and I'm going to go ahead and put a clip here at the end of how to do it on your cell phone and how to get used to using these settings. Hopefully you guys really enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, any comments, anything you want to add, anything you want to say, please feel free to comment down below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I only ask that you like and subscribe. Have a great day, and I hope you guys really enjoyed. Alright, so guys, I wanted to explain that if you still don't know how all these settings work, pull out your phone. I'm using right now a OnePlus 5, my personal phone, but see if your phone has a Pro mode just like mine does. See here, Pro mode, and basically in Pro mode I can change my ISO, I can change my white balance, I can change my shutter speed, I can change my aperture, and I can even change the exposure. So when you're looking at your phone and you don't understand all these settings and you still want to get an SLR, a DSLR, or mirrorless camera, maybe play around on your phone until you learn and understand how these settings work individually and as a group together, and you'll be able to take a pretty awesome image.